So immediately to my right is Don Vesio. Don is with Vesio Multisport Performance Services, and they just opened up a new retail shop in Millbury, which I'm looking forward to getting out. Supposedly got a killer CompuTrainer system. And Don is a very strong cyclist, owns numerous cycling records throughout the US and Canada in different time trial competitions. Immediately to Don's right is John Metz. John is a USAT certified coach. He's also got his master's and doctorate in education. So he spends a lot of time with athletes, coaching them, and is just a very good teacher. So we're happy to have him with us. And then finally, to the right, we have, to John's right, we have Karen Smyers. Karen is one of the most accomplished triathletes in the history of the sport. Karen has won the Ironman World Championship. She was one of the first, the first class of the USAT Hall of Fame Karen was inducted in. So Karen has a lot of years of experience, has got a lot of podium finishes, and is here to share her wealth of knowledge with you. So, without further ado, I really do want to turn it right over to the audience, so I'll get the ball rolling unless someone wants to take the first stab at it. And I think this gentleman right here looks like he's ready. I'm going to hand it right over.
I have a question. How much percentage-wise can an athlete expect to improve their performance by using performance meters? I've never used the knowledge.
So just take your turns there.
Well, first of all, we'd have to take a look at what the current level of the athlete would be. So it would really be difficult to quantify what kind of percentage that we would expect, because we would have to take a look at all the factors. What's the age of the athlete? What is the experience of the athlete? What background do they have? So, for example, if I had someone who we would consider to be a newbie in the sport and wasn't really a strong cyclist, if we were to immediately give that cyclist a power meter, we could say, wow, look at how much more they've improved over time. Where if we took an athlete who was already at peak performance and peak fitness, their percentage of increasing performance would be a lot less. I will tell you this though, of the athletes that I have, of those that work with power and those that either choose not to work with power or don't work with power for other reasons, it's cost prohibitive or whatever the case might be, I see greater gains with those athletes that do use power.
And I would like to re-emphasize some of the points that was just made. It's really important to get a baseline assessment, and obviously the athletes who are more accomplished and who have spent more time in the sport will see a relatively smaller percentage gain as opposed to someone who's just starting out fresh and clean slate. Now, one of the really important things that you can gain by using power meters and heart rate monitors is not only assessment of your performance at a particular point in time, but if you monitor the data over a course of time, you'll be able to use those values for predictive analysis. So you'll be able to better anticipate, in other words, whether you're ramping your training up appropriately for an event, or whether you might be on the verge of overtraining. It's a really important tool, in other words, to see not only how you're performing on any given day, but also as a way to really quantify the amount of load it's placing on your body and how your body's responding to that load, so you can make appropriate adjustments going forward with your coach and your training programs. Hard to tell, we're both from education.
Karen, I assume you train with power?
Hello? So I guess I can add a sort of different perspective a little bit in that I started training for the sport back in the 80s before power meters were, I don't even know if they existed, but they certainly weren't in vogue. Same with heart rate monitors. So I did learn to train a lot by intuition. And so I have since started to use heart rate monitors and power meters in my training, but I have found that it refines my training a little bit, but I found that I had very good body intuition already, so I was actually training in the right zones most of the time just through experience. But now that I'm coaching people, I just love when they do use these tools because it makes sure we're on the same page. It does give me, very exact workouts that I can give them that I'm sure that they're working out in the proper zones. And it's good motivation when you have that exact feedback of, I want you to hold this wattage for these number of intervals. They really can say, I nailed that workout, whereas in the past it would be like, yeah, I felt pretty good and I worked pretty hard, So it gives you this feedback that's invaluable as a coach. But you will find that when you say how much can you improve, I don't know that it improved my training a whole lot having that feedback, but it was definitely interesting that, I already sort of had a pretty good idea of what to do without those tools. So you can learn to teach your body to sort of intuitively know these numbers a little bit yourself. So one of the things I tell, especially when it comes to heart rate monitors, is I'm trying to teach people to learn about their body by using the tools to teach them. So when you're at a certain heart rate, you should associate that with your breathing pattern, with feeling in your muscles, in your legs, like how hard that feels, whether there's this feeling of heaviness or lactic acid or whatever accumulating, how much concentration it takes to hold the pace. So there's 4 or 5 different feedback things that you should be also paying attention to. So these are tools that you're putting together into one big package that's going to make you a more educated athlete and be able to really, get the most out of your body.
So I'm going to ask a question. So all that involved using power meters when training. What about during race day? Should you use one? Should you turn it off? What do you recommend?
I'll capture every workout I ever do. I'll capture my heart rate data and my power data without exception. Race day, however, I tend to be overly obsessive at times about numbers. So what I do is I actually hover over the screen of my power meter, and I'm not able to see the data live. What I'll do is I'll rely on perceived exertion. I'll rely on other physiological cues that I've calibrated using my heart rate data, my power meter data over time. And then when I get back at home after the event, I'll go back and cross-reference my power data performance or power data measures with my actual physical performance. Some people will use power meters as a way to establish pacing. It works really well for some people. They'll know that for a 40-kilometer event, they need to be an X percentage of their threshold. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But I found, for me and several clients that I work with, sometimes it's better to use the power meter very extensively in training sessions to calibrate how your body's responding to different levels of intensity. And then come race day, focus more on the race, the strategies, the non-quantifiable variables that you need to address. And then go back and reconcile your felt sense, your perceived exertion with the actual data that you're recording. It's something not everyone does, but it's becoming frequent, or more frequent, at least seeing.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between, maximum heart rate between the different, disciplines? How you find those between cycling, swimming, and running? And are they close? Do you have to do that assessment for each specific sport, or can you find one and then kind of figure that out with numbers?
Want to give it a shot?
I'll give it a shot.
Okay.
First of all, we actually wouldn't look at maximum heart rate. We would look at your lactate threshold, or your lactate threshold heart rate. It will be different for most athletes for the bike and for the run. Typically, we're looking at maybe about 10 beats per minute higher for the run than the bike. That obviously will be different for different athletes. Once you there's different testing protocol that you can go through. You can actually do a complete VO2 max test. If you're a real glutton for punishment and you like pain, you can do a VO2 max test. I don't know if that's really necessary for the average athlete to know what I think people like to know what that number is so they can talk about it. Just like with power, people will say, well, I pull 400 watts, or well, what does that mean? So it's really the lactate threshold, and that's relatively easy to find. There's different ways that you can test for that. Once you know your lactate threshold, there's percentages that you go up or down to figure out your different training zones. So typically with heart rate, we use 5 zones. Zone 1 is a recovery, Zone 2, Zone 2 and 3 are a certain percentage below your lactate threshold, and then you go into Zone 5. Your lactate threshold is actually the break between Zone 4 and 5, and then 5 is an area that you should not be in unless you're sprinting or you're just doing, you're working out in that area for very short periods of time. I don't know if you guys know the exact percentages. I mean, you can find them. There's a lot of Alan Hunter, the authors of those nature. You'll be able to find what the exact percentages are to figure out those percentages. A real easy way to figure out your lactate threshold on both the bike and the run. You don't need any kind of crazy equipment. If you want to figure it out for a run, go out and warm up for about 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes, and then basically go all out for 30 minutes. But when I say all out, that doesn't mean sprint for a minute and then jog for the other 18 or 19 minutes. You need to try to keep a consistent level across that workout. Then during that 30 minutes, you want to take a snapshot by using a heart rate monitor with a lap function on it to capture the last 20 minutes of that all-out effort. That average heart rate will be or very close to your lactate threshold rate. And then you can just plug that number in and you can figure it out. And you can do the same thing for the bike. You just warm up, go for that 30 minutes, take that snapshot of the last 20 minutes, and of course, make sure that you cool down. And my only other advice when you're doing that particular workout is the first time you do it, your numbers probably won't be accurate. It's kind of like any test you take. You got to practice, you got to get used to it. What does all out for 30 minutes really feel like? Chances are the first time you do it, you won't make the 30 minutes, or what you'll find is your heart rate will die off, or your power will drop, or you'll become fatigued. So do it a few times before you're really locked in on that number, and then you can easily calculate your lactate threshold from there.
Ignore anything that you read in a book that tells you your zones. It's so individual. That's why you do the test, is that will give you your lactate threshold heart rate. You could be the same age as the person next to you, and your average heart rate for that 30-minute time trial, or the final 20 minutes of a 30-minute time trial, might be 179, and the guy next to you that's your age, it could be 159. So there's 20 beats of difference between you guys. And if you look at those crazy things they put on the treadmills, or that you might read in a book and it's 220 minus your age, you'd think, well, what? That they'd be off by 20 beats, So just ignore those. It's crazy. Anytime they give you an absolute heart rate, it's the same thing with training through pregnancy. The doctor will tell you, well, you can never get your heart rate over 130 or something like that. Well, that's some number that they came up with that will make sure that it covers every single person in the population so that they don't get in trouble if the person goes over that heart rate. But it's, I knew that when I was pregnant, 150 beats was completely aerobic and it was very safe. So, hundreds of people that I coach on the bike, I see variations of at least 30 beats of people the same age. So you have to find out what your threshold is, and then you calculate your zones from that. And that's why you do it as a percentage, and the same with the max could be, you don't know, the max is not a good, for one thing, most people don't ever get to their max. They think they do and they don't. Someone come into bike class and tell me their max is, 170, and second class I have them up at 173, and I'm like, I guess you didn't really know what your max was, because you're still not there.
A common theme I think that you're starting to hear is that you really have to be very much attuned to your body and how it responds to different types of training and race stresses. And a good protocol when using a heart rate monitor or a power meter is not so much to focus on absolute values. Again, heart rates will vary from individual to individual, and power will as well. Last week we ran a series of different performance tests at our training center, and people were occasionally elated with the results, and sometimes they were very depressed. You mean my power at threshold is 280? That's fantastic. Well, it is if you were 180 pounds, but you're almost 300, it skews your results a little bit. I guess the real thing that you need to be aware of is that the data really is another perspective on how your body feels, how your body is responding to different training stimuli. And the things that you read in books and the things that you might see in online forums, they're just general rules of thumb or guidelines. And part of the variables that they factor into these guidelines are, potential litigation, for instance. So while you're working with your coach, it's really important to provide quality data, and a good coach will help you analyze and interpret the data to better structure programs for your individual needs.
I'm just going to add one more thing quickly to that. Even if you do know your lactate threshold, your heart rate for the lactate threshold, and you've calculated the numbers, keep in mind, heart rate is a response to the stimulus. There could be other factors that could be coming into play. Caffeine will affect your heart rate. Lack of sleep will affect your heart rate. Dehydration will affect your heart rate. So even if you know what your numbers are, don't be thrown off by one day's numbers. It's over the course of a period of time. And that's why if everything was equal and I had my way with all my athletes, they would use both power and heart rate, because that gives me more data to work with. If we're just working off a heart rate, there's so many factors that can come into play that could make that make that heart rate crazy. Quick story, I was looking at some analysis of one of my athletes' training workouts, and I hadn't talked to them prior to them emailing the workout, and I was looking through and I noticed there was a really big spike. They didn't have a power meter. There was a really big spike in their heart rate, but I also noticed that their cadence dropped and their speed dropped. So I thought they were going up a hill. That would make sense to me. If I would have had a power reading as well, if they were going up a hill, I would have seen that their power would have been increasing. So I talked to them on the telephone. Well, what happened is they got into an altercation. They almost got hit by a car. So heart rate went up because they were scared out of their mind, and they slowed down and their cadence dropped because they needed to regain their composure before they could go on. So it had nothing to do with their training. It had nothing to do with an interval workout or a sprint or a huge hill they were climbing. It had to do with they had a 3,000-pound vehicle trying to run them down. So watch, you got to really watch that heart rate.
They figure out their max heart rate.
Quick question. You said something about obviously heart rate will be affected by certain things. What I've noticed is that you can have an illness coming on and you don't perceive it yet. But your heart rate, your resting heart rate when you get up in the morning, when you should take it, is elevated. Now, have you seen a correlation yet between when it's elevated when people are getting sick and when they actually end up having a bad race day? In other words, can you predict your race day based on your change from predicted resting heart rate that morning? Do you see that this is going to be a bad day for me?
Like to give a shot, or do you want to try?
I have to say I haven't tracked that consistently enough to know, but I have read that is the case, that your heart rate, your resting heart rate will go up a little bit if you're fighting something or something's coming on. So I would imagine that you could probably use that to predict a bad race, but I think I would probably discourage my athletes from reading that far into it, because sometimes it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? If you think you're going to have a bad day, then you may. So I wouldn't want to completely discourage it, because there are other factors that might tick it up a little bit. So I think if it's it might help you to avoid some overtraining is another thing, and maybe to know to give them an extra rest day or something like that. But you don't want to read too much into it as well.
One of the things that we try to do is we encourage our athletes to track their data over different segments of time. So what we try to do is look at data trends over a 7-day period to see the acute impact of training might have on the body, and we'll look at variables associated with heart rate as well as variables associated with power. That's really good micro snapshot, but it isn't all that predictive. It tells you how hard a hard week might be, or it tells you how easy a recovery week might have been. What we also do is look at data over a 40-day rolling period and an 80-day rolling period, and we try to look at broad trend we do a broad trend analysis of that information. Now, there's lots of mathematical modeling one could do in order to use that data as a way to predict future performance. And depending on the models that you use, the results could be almost spookily accurate. But I think, as Karen is pointing out, you also cannot discount individual day-to-day variables and also the variables of competition day of event. So when our athletes are preparing for their season, and we know they're approaching their A-level race, and it's a very important event for them, we will have a very good sense of how recovered they might be, what variables they might need to be addressing in the days leading up to the event. We also will have a general sense of whether there is different health factors impacting their performance. But once you start actually getting to the day of the event, all that data kind of goes away. And I think sometimes we can look at too much data and it could negatively impact our ability to perform. We might have as Karen pointed out, we might be self-fulfilling a negative prophecy when in fact we really could do much better than the data might indicate. So data is just another way, again, of trying to get a better read of yourself.
Just from my experience, it's quite common that you pick up the heart rates of people next to you. If you have, someone that's using the same brand of heart rate monitor, a lot of times people end up getting the heart rate of the person next to them. So that's a problem for sure. And that's why it's good to sort of have a sense like, okay, I can tell by the way I'm breathing right now that there's no way my heart rate is 190. So it's good to have, a little bit of a sense of yourself so that you can kind of throw out those heart rates that you just realize aren't making sense. Same thing can happen running under a power line or something like that. All of a sudden you get this really weird reading on your monitor. So you're not having a heart attack, it's just picking up some weird feedback somewhere. So there definitely are some glitches in the system, and so it's good to know about those. So that might be some of what's going on. Also the dehydration, if you come in a little bit dehydrated, sometimes that'll affect your heart rate, or get dehydrated over the course of the workout you're doing, that definitely will affect it. So there's other things like that you have to watch out for as well.
If your spinning instructor is really pretty, that might raise your heart rate as well. Again, this goes to my point about using both heart rate and power. If your heart rate goes up, but your power decreases, that tells me one thing. If your heart rate goes up and your power goes up, that tells me a totally different thing. So as much of the data is that you can collect and use to provide either to yourself or to the coach that you're working with is going to be helpful.
One of the things that you'll frequently see in a lot of discussion forums associated with cycling or the cycling component of triathlon is that heart rate these days is completely irrelevant. You don't need to track heart rate. There are many people who take great pride in ignoring their heart rate data, discarding that information completely. I'm not using proper, MIT physics definitions right now, okay? But think of power as the amount of work you're performing, and your heart rate is your response to the effort of producing that amount of power. I think it's really important to look at both parameters. And there are days in which your power values might be very high and your heart rates might be low. That is, as John pointed out, that does give your coach and yourself a very specific indicator of what was going on during the workout. You need to also factor in environmental considerations. So most spinning studios tend to be small, fairly tight spaces. The temperature will significantly increase during a session, and your heart rate will drift in response to those environmental variables. Also factor in whether or not you're drinking enough, whether or not you drank too much the night before. All of these do have an impact on your heart rate as well. So the key is really, it's like those little, pointilless pictures that you see. They don't make sense when you look at them up close, but the data really starts to emerge into very specific patterns when you step back and look at it over a period of time. So athletes that I work with sometimes will come to me in crisis and say, I tried to do my intervals, my heart rate was really low, my power was really low, I'm going to pick up another sport and I'm done. And I go, no, step back, let's look at your performance over the past 4 weeks, look at it over an 8-week framework, look at the bigger picture. And that's oftentimes really hard to do when you're getting real-time data feedback.
A little closer.
Well, and can you tell where you are? Like, even if you didn't have those tools, are you able to really consciously know what percentages you're working at without that information, and know where you are and where you want to be of those percentages throughout racing and training?
I think, I started racing in 1981, and you started much after me. I know that. But we didn't have heart rate monitors, and we didn't have power meters at the time. But you can, by different physiological cues, really give a good assessment of how intense you're working at any given moment in time. So there's really 3 data streams you're working with. You're working with heart rate, you're working with power, and you're also working with perceived exertion. And if you train a lot with a heart rate monitor, or if you train a lot with a power meter, you calibrate your felt sense of how intense a given effort might be. A lot of people over time and trial and error self-discover what these zones might be. You also can read a lot by, if you are able to have a conversation and you're not really sweating all that hard, you're at X zone. And if you're starting to breathe a little bit heavy and your speech is punctuated by gas, you're at a different level. That's a good start, but by using the data tools that are available, you can be much more precise. And then day of the event, if you don't have your heart rate monitor or you choose not to use your power meter, you'll still be able to accurately assess the level of intensity at any given moment in time.
And you'll also find that even amongst professional athletes, some are still choosing not to use some of those tools. I was in Kona in October, and I had an opportunity to talk with some of those athletes, and one said to me, "I'm old school, and if that works, that works." My broad generalization to answer your question would be, older athletes probably are more in tune to their body because they didn't have some of the tools that the younger athletes have today. And the younger athletes and the younger generations in general tend to be so hyper-focused on the data. And that's what people always talk about. I mean, everyone, that's what I mentioned earlier. People want to know what their VO2 max is. Well, your VO2 max is what your VO2 max is. It's not going to change that much. So what's the value of knowing that number? Well, you can tell your friends. Same thing with your maximum output for your wattage. You can know that number, but your functional threshold wattage is much more important to know those numbers, so you can figure the other zones and percentages out. Well, I don't know if there's any way to calculate that, because again, your anxiety level on race day is going to be different. I know some people that are just loose as goose on race day, and then there's other people that are so uptight they can't even speak 2 words to you. So I think that to be able to say, expect your heart rate to be 5 beats per minute higher on race day than it normally would be. That goes back to being in tune to your body, and you have to be able to make some decisions on race day, and you have to be able to potentially discard what your heart rate is telling you, and you have to say, I feel good, and I see a person ahead of me who's in my age group, and I'm going after her. Or you have to be able to make the decision, I'm backing off, and because I know this race course, and I know that there's some hills coming up, and I need to save myself to take on those variations in the terrain of the course. So again, it's very individual. I don't think that there's any way to really say, expect your heart rate to be at this level because it happens to be the day of the race.
I think a little bit also depends on, it sounds like you're training with your heart rate monitor, but you don't maybe have a really good sense of what it's telling you. Like, if you know, in general, when I do this training session, my heart rate average is about this, it might not actually help you in your race very much unless you know, all right, for a race that takes me 1 hour, I know I can hold probably about this heart rate. For a race that's 5 hours, I know I better not let my heart rate get above this. So I think a little bit depends on the race distance that you're doing, because I find for the longer races, it's a lot more valuable for some of my athletes and for me, because there's a lot of times where you can not realize that you're like going up a hill kind of hard, because there's a delay in your perceived exertion and how it'll feel in your legs. fluid. So you might want to, for a long race, you might want to keep your heart rate under a certain level, because you know once you go over there, you're burning more glycogen and it's an unsustainable level for you. So it depends a little bit on how much knowledge you have about your heart rate, so whether to use it in the race. Because sometimes maybe just you're going by feel and intuition might be actually the best information you have.
We have time for one more question.
For your race season, how often do you do a test for your heart rate? Because it's going to change from the beginning to your A race. I was just wondering how often you should do that.
Go ahead. I'll say something brief and then you can follow up. We do testing at various intervals and frequencies. Off season, what we'll encourage our athletes to do basically is to work a fairly generic 3 weeks on, 1 week recovery, and we may do a testing session for one of their events at the end of the recovery period. In season, we tend to test every 6 to 8 weeks. Again, what we try to do is stagger them so they are at end of recovery periods, so we get actual useful data, and we also make sure that the test itself doesn't negatively impact upon the important performance days.
We pretty much follow those same general guidelines. Off season, we'll be doing more testing than when you're actually in the regular season. But again, whether you're working on if your periodization is 2 weeks, 2 weeks building, and then you're doing a recovery week, I would do testing on that third week with an athlete. So again, it's really getting to know your athlete, what that athlete needs. So whether you're doing it on a 3 week cycle or whatever the case might be, but I think the key point that we follow, that Don pointed out, is it needs to be done as part of recovery to make sure you're getting actual good data that you can use over a long period of time.
We also have found that whether an athlete actually uses their heart rate and power data during a race itself is one issue, but we encourage them to capture it nevertheless. And we find that as the season becomes more active, we're getting larger data sets, more frequent data sets, and we can extrapolate a good deal from just the race day performance. So as a result, we can extend the time between formal testing periods. If someone is doing a 20-kilometer time trial, for instance, and we know that they had a good performance that particular day, they felt really strong, we look at their data, we look at their heart rate, we look at their power, that's actually going to give us a very good assessment of what their threshold values might be as well, and it saves a testing session.